Welcome to our Navigating the Policy Landscape for Cultivated Meat in APAC webinar. I'm Ankur Chaudhary, and I'm the Policy Specialist for APAC at the Good Food Institute Asia Pacific, otherwise known as GFI APAC. Before we get started, I have a few things to share. First of all, for those of you who are new to the work of the Good Food Institute, we are an international non-profit organization that is developing the roadmap for a sustainable, secure, and just protein supply. To do that, we identify the most effective solutions, we mobilize resources and talent, and we mobilize partners across the food systems to make alternative proteins accessible, affordable, and most importantly, delicious. Second, this webinar will be recorded. We will post a recording on our YouTube channel, and we will email a recording of the webinar within the next few days. So if you missed part of it or didn't catch something, no worries. We'll send it to you so you can revisit later on. The agenda for today is as follows. I'll give a very short 10-minute presentation on our State of the Industry report and specially cover the policy perspectives. This will be followed by a 45-minute panel discussion and 15 minutes of question and answer session. For the question and answer session, please type your questions in the Q&A box rather than the chat. This helps us to keep track of them more easily. To start with, I would like to introduce the panelists we have today. We have Ms. Carrie Chan, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Avant. Carrie co-founded Avant with Dr. Mario Chin in 2018 in Hong Kong, the first cultivated fish company in Asia, and expanded to Singapore in 2021. Avant's technology offers a system to produce nutritious, tasty fish and functional protein directly from fish shells at economically viable cost. The group's end-to-end technology platform also allows continuous new product development from scratch to production. At Avant, Carrie provides the vision, guides the strategy, and supervises the implementation. We also have Yuki Hanyu-san, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder IntegriCulture. Yuki Hanyu in 2014 founded Sojin Meat Project, the world's first citizen science-based community project for cell-based meat and cellular agriculture in Japan. Based on the low-cost cell culture technology developed there, he founded IntegriCulture in 2015 to commercialize cell-cultured meat. The company develops a B2B infrastructure that enables large and small entities of the food, cosmetics, and material sector for cellular agriculture by providing them necessary hardware, cells, cell-cultured serum, food-grade basal medium, and other related services. Our third and last speaker for today is Sam Lawrence, Vice President of Policy for Asia, Good Food Institute. Sam is GFI's most senior policy representative in Asia, currently based in Melbourne, Australia. Sam transferred to GFI, having spent nearly 4 years building the alternative protein landscape in Australia and New Zealand. Sam has a background in Australian agriculture and as a diplomat for the New Zealand government. With that, I shall get started with her navigating the policy landscape for cultivated meat in APAC. I would start first with the State of the Industry report presentation, especially covering the policy perspectives. First, I would like to introduce what is cultivated meat and seafood. Cultivated meat and seafood is produced directly from animal cells. Meat cultivation facilitates the same biological process that happens inside an animal by providing cells with the warmth and basic nutrition required to build muscle and fat. Started in 2013, Mark Post creates the first cultivated meat burger from cultured muscle. With this trajectory, you can see how the industry has progressed in the times to come. In 2015, birth of the first 4 cultivated meat companies happened. In 2017, we see a Series A funding round. By 2020, we see the first regulatory approval in our very own Singapore. By 2021, the ecosystem grows to about 100 companies worldwide. In 2022, we see a landmark decision where the US FDA greenlights first cultivated meat product. And in 2023, USDA provides full regulatory approval for 2 products and the first sale in high-end restaurants. By 2025, GFI APAC expects, or GFI expects regulatory approval in a multitude of regions. And by 2030, we see how it would become a cost competitive scale with regards to conventional meat. As you can see here, the cultivated meat ecosystem is booming in APAC, with multiple companies coming at the foray and delivering great products. The government is also implementing supportive frameworks and policy frameworks. In 2021, we see in December, China's Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs included cultivated meat in its first 5-year plan. In 2022, we see President Xi Jinping mentions protein diversification at the 2 sessions to support national food security in China. In Singapore in 2021, we see SFA granting manufacturing firm Esco Ester a license to manufacture cultivated meat products. This allows a lot of companies to do contract manufacturing in the approved facility rather than building their own. In 2022, again, we see Singapore marks a world first regulatory approval by giving the Finnish startup Solar Food approvals to sell its protein made from gas fermentation in Singapore, which went on to have the first tasting event in 2023. Similarly, with Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and various other countries in APAC, we see a lot of development happening in the policy space, which marks the significant shift the industry is taking with regards to the policy frameworks in APAC. Cultivated meat, there are different kinds of frameworks which exist with regards to cultivated meat government policy frameworks. Several countries such as Singapore, Canada, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, and the US already have some regulatory provisions or guidance applicable to cultivated meat. Some countries are regulating cultivated meat under their existing novel food frameworks, whereas there are countries which are creating new regulatory frameworks from the scratch. Having said that, there is always an opportunity to learn from one country to the other. So most countries which are currently developing their regulatory frameworks, they do not really have to start from zero, whereas they can start from the first step, which is already taken by countries like Singapore and the United States. We also see a lot of funding mobilization in the public funding space for alternative proteins in APAC. In 2018, in the pre-2020 era, we see a lot of less amount of funding happening, whereas in 2022, we see a significant amount of funding being done. Out of the all-time funding of $1 billion, 610 came in 2022 alone. APAC estimated public funding for alternative protein grew by 37%, which is again a really high percentage compared to the region's diversity and the region's appetite for food. At the same point in time, the all-time public funding in APAC is estimated at about $162 million as of 2022. There is a decline in venture funding due to the funding winter, but we do see a lot of funding happening in the public space with regards to a lot of funding going into the research and development spaces in countries, which has led to the development of the industry altogether. Similarly, continued funding and innovation will drive alternative protein development along the spectrum. We see a lot of companies which are now trying to develop different kinds of mechanisms and different kinds of capabilities to support the cultivated meat ecosystem. We see in the cultivated meat ecosystem, we see companies which are directly producing. We also see companies which are focusing on cell line development, which are focusing on contract manufacturing like Esco Ester. We see scaffolds and cell culture tech being developed. There are companies which are solely dedicated to developing bioreactors, media ingredients and growth factors. And then there are companies like Avant, which is focused on cultivated seafood. Therefore, we see a lot of diversification which is happening in this particular space. And government's continued funding to drive innovation would facilitate the development of alternative protein space in general. With this, I would first like to start with the webinar and with the panel discussion. And I would first like to invite Carrie to give her opening comments. Carrie, I want to start first with what do you think are the key challenges or the biggest challenges which the cultivated meat companies are facing in navigating the policy landscape in APAC?
Thank you, Ankur. Nice to meet you all, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's webinar. And thank you for the introduction of the whole overall landscape. For us, because we are coming from a startup company perspective, and we are navigating different jurisdictions as they develop. So I think what we experiences one of the biggest challenge is that indeed there are no very clear same line of alignment in terms of course the procedure. Different jurisdiction, different government will have their different procedure, and some of them may involve one government agency, some of them may involve more than one, and some of the region, because we are active in Singapore as well as in China, and so there are a lot of these different kind of like a government are still under development. But then maybe I will give a very quick 2-3 points of a summary of the challenges. First of all, we do detect some kind of duplication in efforts. In particular, of course, Singapore is already have the framework already available. SFA is very the steps and what we need to submit to the agency is very clear. But when we actually explore talking to other regulators in other area, usually we need to start from scratch about, okay, how the process look like, what kind of cell lines, etc., etc. So we detect that this kind of learning process, it happened more than once. That is most recent case that we have actually happening in APAC. There have been actually some similar exercises done overseas as well, more than a year or 2 years ago, led by a team of a non-profit kind of a group of people as well. So we actually see that this happening multiple times. And FAO also announced a report about the cell-based food safety as well recently. But I think this is like the process from cell line and all of the steps. I think at one point, it would be nice to have something quite open source and actually recognized by the scientific kind of community so that different regulators do not need to start from scratch. Another point that I would like to mention is that so far, I think one of the challenge for us is that we're still very careful in terms of the cell culture medium. And there are a lot of innovation in the space of replacement of FBS. And indeed, they come from different expression system or different kind of like methods. And from time to time, despite that they are very promising, but then on the regulatory point of perspective, it's actually sometimes it's a little bit novel to let's say for us to decide whether it's something we would like to incorporate that quite considerably in our process, which because if there are some challenges in the clearance later on, that may be some time implication on the time to go to market. So then that I think in the community, there have been some discussion about whether these different components of the medium, including growth factor, alternative way of growth factor, would deserve a separate kind of approval, kind of like a way or like a system or mechanism as well. So these are the couple of points I would like to bring up in terms of the challenges we face now. Thank you.
Oh, so I would just like to bring in like Yuki as well and understand from him like what are the different ways in which companies are trying to engage with policymakers and stakeholders in APAC to navigate like these kind of challenges which are there.
Yeah, so our case of IntegriCulture, I'm not quite sure if it's like reproduced, it can be reproduced in other countries, but in case of Japan, the engagement started with open source materials from Shoji Meat project, exciting at a personal level, the government officials and other key decision makers of that time and now and probably in the future as well. And this happened until around like 2016 to 2020. And out of that background, the JACA and Parliamentary Caucus for Cellular Agriculture were established around 2020 to 2021 to build and amplify the cross-sector momentum of cellular agriculture for policymakers and regulators. So with that background, well, originally built by the Chaudhary Meat and Cell Agriculture Institute of the Commons and other key individuals, JACA now provides the unified voice of stakeholders of cell agriculture, including existing corporations such as the old food. And well, unfortunately, the government officials would not take seriously if it were just a few startups saying something, but by building a unified voice, including the corporates, things are moving.
Oh,
So that's our experience.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for that input. So like just to dwell like a little bit on it. So like with regards to like whether it be Japan or whether it be APAC as a region altogether, what do you think would be the key policy priorities which like the governments can focus on and which the industry can also focus on, that okay, if this gets solved, like let's say like in the next 3 to 5 years, it would be really great for the industry. So like what would be those key policy priorities be?
Yeah, so a lot of the governments in APAC region are now concerned about the food security, not food safety, food security. And obviously food safety as well, but at the government policy level, I think Singapore 30 by 30 is a quite symbolic one. But countries like China, Japan and Korea, we learn from the primary school time that about the food self-sufficiency rate and such. So there's like actually, even if it's not made into an official, even if it's not officially pronounced, there is certainly support for the case of cell agriculture among key decision makers. And actually, at least for the management level of cell agriculture startups, it is actually quite. We find it quite useful to actually tap into that background or the baseline awareness among the government key decision makers about the food security, and also and based on that, like what APAC SCA has been doing. So basically, they're building a unified voice. That's I think is an absolute necessity. While it can be further amplified by building some sort of an ecosystem, including other sectors. And at least in our case in Japan, one of the winning arguments quite recently is that this is not just about food, but it's basically about building an entire new industry that benefits manufacturing and other sectors as well, and which basically leads to economic growth or whatever. Yeah.
No, sure, absolutely. So I would like to bring Carrie in as well on the same question around like what are the key policy priorities which the governments, but as well as like the industry needs to focus on like in the next 3 to 5 years as a whole.
So yeah, I chime in with what Yuki said. I think in Asia, I think like Asia and beyond, food security is one of the biggest kind of pond. However, I think then the other, in terms of the policy priority, I would say that I think, Sam, you may have some experience to share because you're the government diplomat, right? So different government, they have different kind of internal processes. So I've seen regulators like a certain food safety department in the region that when we approach them to say that, oh, we are actually producing this, and then we just detected that they don't have the existing infrastructure. Infrastructure means that the government regulation department in place. So they have people focusing on food safety, which is like those kind of like bacteria that can get into food and don't get people food poisoning. But when it gets to a little bit more like a biochemical, like a kind of beyond those scope, we saw that actually some government department, they need a lot of time to actually determine the policy, to put resources into building a civil servant team, and then have to pull in resources into taking care of those. So I think those are maybe the second group or the third group of countries in APAC. They are fully aware of this, but then I think they need time to actually put the resources in order to regulate this. So I think this is not just on the policy, but then, well, I think they would, of course, on the policy, they would need to be high up on the government kind of priority so that they put resources in doing that. So I don't know whether, Sam, you have some observation along that line as well.
Sure. And one of the main focuses, I think, of GFI, of course, is discussing with governments on public funding, which can have a catalyzing effect. I'd say that tying in the potential seen by some of the government departments from different angles, food security being one, as Yuki mentioned previously, and also economic development, as Yuki also hit upon, tying those in with the funding priorities for national science agencies, I think also remains important for us. But of course, the biggest hurdle, I think, from our perspective, remains that lack of a clear regulatory path to market. From a GFI perspective, continuing these policy discussions remains a key focus across the region, including in Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, but also many other countries in APAC. But really, I think one of the key challenges that we face is the proliferation of different priorities and tying them together in a holistic way within each country that makes sense for that individual country's national priorities.
No, thank you so much, Sam, for that. Like that sets the stage for like the second question, like which I had for everyone, which was that there are different national priorities which are there, which are going in tandem with regards to what the country priorities may be. But at the same point in time, like with regards to food, we have seen it like in the past as well, like with different other food technologies, that there is an economic prosperity angle which comes with the trade part of it. And then we see like food being like something like which needs like a lot of coordination across the board with regards to its consumption, like from the general population. So what are the like how can we ensure that there is some kind of coordination with regards to the cultivated meat regulations across the APAC markets, whether it be, for example, like something is happening in Thailand, something is happening in Singapore, something is happening in Malaysia and Indonesia. So how do we coordinate, and how do we get like few basic things on the same page with everyone?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I suppose on that point, the first thing to note is that the sector is already taking a really proactive position on coordination. Harmonization is quite a strong word. I think coordination is possibly more of a realistic goal. And GFI is already working with APAC Society for Cellular Agriculture on regulatory coordination through a specific forum of that name. And that's a partnership so far that's published, I believe, 2 discussion papers. The last ahead of SIAW 2 months ago, and has its next meeting, I think, this coming January. But I think more broadly, the need for harmonization is pretty clear to be able to facilitate market growth. And in the future, looking ahead a few years, of course, to streamline trade across borders. For example, HS codes for cellular agriculture products don't yet exist. And that's something that GFI is already looking at, for example, through the World Customs Organization. So regulatory coordination is necessary both within the region, but also globally. The time for this is, of course, now, before frameworks in different jurisdictions, as you touched upon, Ankur, before they become too far advanced and incompatible with each other. And GFI more broadly works with policymakers on the surrounding supportive regulatory frameworks to ensure that that path to market in each jurisdiction is as smooth as possible. And I think that goes really to the heart of everything we do, and the effectiveness of that work, which is collaboration. And I think it's important for our contacts within government, within regulatory bodies, to hear the same consistent messages from GFI and from industry to aid them in deciding processes that are fit for purpose. And we welcome further conversations on this, and I'm really glad that there's a number of regulators on the call today.
Sure, absolutely. So just to like get like the industry perspective on this, like Carrie and Yuki, like first Carrie can go and then like I think Yuki can also like chime in. How important is this regulatory coordination at this point in time, and what would be the implication like on the right side of it? Like what would be the positives? Like if it happens, what would be the positive? And if for some ungodly reason it doesn't happen at all, like what would be the negative consequences for the industry altogether?
So I start or Carrie starting? Okay, I can start. Okay, I
Sure.
can start, but so the obvious negative will be like different cell agriculture startups will be locked into its own country. That's an and that prospect alone will be quite negative in fundraising because the future potential market size will be quite limited then. So that alone is already big enough negative, to be honest.
Sure, absolutely. Carrie, your take on this?
Yeah, I think company like us are running around and trying to bet on which is the next country or next government is going to give the first approval. So we might be kind of first in our own country, like depending on how fast and slow our kind of respective area is doing. But like we kind of running around, which is the next one, right? So I think that strategically make our life could be quite challenging. And of course, then that lead to the question along the line, what Yuki said is investors are also thinking about, so when they think about investing, they would kind of put that into perspective as well. So which company in which location would they have a more higher visibility or lower cost of getting the compliance, right? If I don't need to go somewhere else, maybe in the US, then of course, everyone stay put and I spend less to do that. But if not, then I need to run around. So I think this one way or the other is having kind of like implication on the company strategy as well as the fundraising as well.
Sure, absolutely. And that's a really good point around investor sentiment and how like the market would develop. For the market to develop, there is also like this angle of consumer acceptance, which has come in like a lot. So what role do you think the consumer acceptance will play in shaping the future of cultivated meat regulation part of it? So if, for example, like the consumer has like a higher level of acceptance, would it have like a direct impact on the policy? And if yes, then what do you think would be the pathway with regards to that movement altogether?
Well, I think it depends on the time frame of like now or in 10 years' time. And if we are talking about now, I think we have to be very careful about the negative consumer acceptance for the whole concept of cell agriculture, and like turning out to be like the thing going on in Italy would be one case of like it's politicized, could be politicized, but negative consumer acceptance. And if for the long term, consumer acceptance of individual component technologies needs some attention, I think, like immortalization, use of growth factors and such. But we have to be really careful. It's a hard reality, but the regulations on the use of these technologies may happen on completely unscientific backgrounds. So anticipating that kind of thing to happen, the sort of momentum among regulators and policymakers that we should establish now is basically stick to science. And on the bright side, if we can show enough cases of like tasty food made by cell agriculture technology, that alone works against the kind of like gloomy scenarios that I just mentioned.
No, sure, absolutely. And like taking the example of like Italy altogether, I want to throw it back to Sam and Carrie as well to like check like what do you think like the role of consumer acceptance would be, and at the same point in time, like one of the great points which Yuki mentioned was regulation based on unscientific presumption or assumptions. Like in Italy, like one of the reasons which they gave was that they need to conserve like their food heritage. When they banned cultivated meat. So Sam, I would first come to you and then to Carrie, but what are your takes or what are your perspectives on it, and how do you think it would play out in a region like APAC?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we're seeing at the moment a worldwide backsliding on this issue in some respects. We're seeing some regressive policies, I think, in quick succession over the last 6 months. We've seen Italy, we've seen Romania, potentially Austria. We're seeing a number of countries in South America. There was a bill in Brazil, in Chile, I believe in Uruguay, 2 states in the United States in the last 6 months. And from a policy perspective, when we look at these bills, we see some pretty strong commonalities across these bills. So GFI is looking at this pretty closely at the moment. And if and how this is a coordinated approach globally by certain elements, we're not sure yet. I haven't seen such activity yet in the Asia-Pacific region, I'm pleased to say. The regulators and the contacts that we've been working with across the region are very open. We've had excellent dialogue with them. They are in turn having excellent dialogue with industry. On the specific point of consumer acceptance, of course, GFI doesn't engage directly in consumer-facing work. I am aware of some studies looking at that. And I think possibly more needs to be done, research in that space in different markets. Asia is a very diverse area and region, and I don't think what's applicable in one jurisdiction is necessarily applicable in another. So I think we've got a bit of work to do there in assessing consumer sentiment.
No, sure, absolutely, and that's a great point. Carrie, I would come to you, but before to that, like I would like to tell our audience that like if you have a question or answer, like please feel free to keep typing in, and I would try to take it like as we go. But Carrie, coming to you, like in your company as well, like what role do you think the consumer acceptance would play, and how much it would impact like regulations in the years to come? Because Singapore is already like on its pathway to like good seafood cultivated meat companies which are coming up in the region, and you also see like a higher level of movement in that space. So beyond the safety aspects of food and like other things, like how do you think like consumer acceptance, like from a messaging perspective, would play out in the regulation sphere?
Yeah, so I think we are very grateful to be like in Singapore, because I think because of the high level government policy, the regulation and general awareness of the general public actually quite there, so that they are quite open-minded to this cultivated food. Even though a lot of the majority of the people here still have not eaten one. But however, I think similar kind of approach could also be considered by other government as well. So I totally agree with some conversation earlier, is that it's not just for whatever goodwill, but actually we need cultivated meat and this new technology for food security, as well as actually it created a lot of economic value as well, because it is a very big ecosystem of a lot of different kind of new supply material supply chain get into that. So I think this is very important. I also think that we are quite grateful at the moment, finger crossed, not a lot of the counter kind of these new novel food of kind of things going on. But I think that because Asia, the culture is that it's still quite government kind of like big government situation. A lot of the country, big government means that in general sense that the government establishes policy and given some guidance, actually the population will kind of quite listen to that. So I think in APAC, I cannot comment on other region. I think that the government has a very key role to play in various kind of APAC location, where they can actually if they do see that is something that they can fit into the policy, just like in China, I think it's definitely very beneficial for the industry if they do have that policy highly visible, as well as promoting that on that level. While then on the other side, I think then it will be the job of us, like the startup company, who come up with tasty, price kind of sensible kind of product into the market. So yeah, this is what I think the situation in APAC.
No, sure, absolutely. Thank you so much. I would like to now bring in like since like we have like the word government like mentioned like throughout like this webinar, and we also had like a government meeting in the form of COP28, where I think like almost everyone was present, and Sam as well. So I would like to direct this question directly to Sam, that how can we address like the environmental and sustainability implications of cultivated meat production in APAC? And what do you draw like from like COP28, like with UNEP and FAO like coming out in support? FAO, of course, like on the agriculture part, and UNEP like highlighting the need for cultivated meat as part of like the production system, agricultural production system. How do you see this landscape evolving, and what's your key takeaway from COP28 to start with?
Yeah, it was. Thank you for the question. I think UNEP the UNEP report was a great step in the right direction in terms of broad global discussion on the topic, and I was very pleased to see that report published. The FAO report, I think, has some way to go. I think there's a lot of work and analysis. It was only released a few days ago. There's a lot of work and analysis now underway to look at the gaps within that report. One of which, of course, is alternative proteins in their broader sense. And that work is now in progress, and I think we'll hear more about that in the coming week or so. The FAO, I would say, has a very important role to play in this conversation, and I think the conversation is becoming more relevant within the FAO as a forum. Going back to your question around COP, it was very clear that that food now has a central position in terms of conversations within COP, which is very different from 2 years ago. I think the food conversation within COP started last year in earnest, and this year really took off. But as with all things, I think the progress will be slow with COP. And anybody who's looked at the news today will see that we may very well not end up with a final outcome from COP at all, including on fossil fuels. So we can see how contentious issues, including some of the biggest, if not the biggest, issues in the world are, and how difficult it is to achieve consensus. And I imagine that it will be no easier in the food and agriculture space, of course. But we also need to remember the measure as to what alternative proteins and cultivated meat specifically are being measured against, and that's conventional animal proteins, which produce over 20% of global emissions. And that's just a fact. It's clear that alternative proteins in general can address the 20% of emissions that come from industrial animal agriculture. 70% of arable land, as we know, is used to grow feed for livestock, which produce just 18% of the world's calories. And I think some recognition of that is now being seen within the COP context and within the FAO context. And we're seeing more attention on that from the conventional animal agriculture sector as well. And it would be good, of course, to have more in-depth and more engaged conversations with all sectors of agriculture, so that we can discuss how alternative proteins play a complementary role in the global food system. Of course, we also need to focus on, there has been a focus on renewable energy empowering alternative protein facilities. And in a really recent development, of course, the announcement that we saw overnight, just tonight, between Cell Agritech and Umami Meats, with their new facility in Malaysia, highlighted the renewable energy aspect of that partnership. So we're really seeing that focus on sustainability now play out in real life capital expenditure as well, which is really hugely encouraging. But as a sector, I think we also need to stand behind the science. We're aware of the LCAs around cultivated meat. We also need to renew calls, I think, for investment, both public and private, into alternative proteins and cultivated meat, of course, in particular. Research shows that we need around $10 billion per year in this sector to unlock the potential of alternative proteins. And as GFI APAC's recent State of the Industry report demonstrated, both the livestock sector and global transport sector each contributes around 14% of emissions. However, in terms of low carbon transport, it receives I think, a whopping, if memory serves, 84 times the public expenditure than alternative proteins did, which is why GFI continues to call on governments to increase public R&D expenditure in the sector.
Those are like really staggering numbers, Sam. But I would also like to now like take this like time to focus like a little bit on the opportunity side of it, because like we have discussed like the challenges like in higher level of detailing, and I don't want to be like all pessimistic at this point, at least. So I would like to take this opportunity to be like a little bit more optimistic and invite like everyone to like say like what would be like the key opportunities which like from a policy perspective are there, and how does APAC government navigate it? So maybe I can start with Carrie and then go to Yuki and then probably Sam, if that's all right.
Yeah, so yeah, there's a lot of thing as we discussed, there's a lot of thing opportunity that can be done in terms of the policy in APAC. I think talking like extending from the COP kind of like conversation as well. It is good that food is kind of, well, finally being taking a bit more center stage of the conversation. But I think for those who are concerned, including us, it is not tangible enough. For example, when we talk about food or in other kind of like transition to the new technology, be it energy or something else, a lot of the time consumer behavior need more than just individual goodwill to change. It cannot change overnight. And when it comes to food, it's definitely a lot more kind of like longer time to build up a new habit and behavior. So I think we have been trying to advocate government policy or various kind of things that we can actually, two things. One is to incentivize people to basically consume more sustainable, sustainably kind of like produced food, or discourage from consuming not so sustainable kind of source food. Like it could be something that like alternative protein, or something that like that involve a very long kind of coaching, delivery, etc. So we thinking about something like leveling playing field, which is I think one thing that will be beneficial. And then yeah, and then I think then the other is that the labeling. So I always in a couple of occasions, I actually mentioned, let's say we have a group of very well-hearted kind of consumers, and if we now imagine we go to a supermarket, where do we identify the most sustainable options of things? Like if I buy pasta, I don't know which one is more produced sustainably. And so I think then the other, if we want people to vote by their wallet and vote by their feet, and we need to let them know how do they choose, right? Otherwise, how do I know? I know that eating vegetable is definitely greener than eating meat, right? But then, but I buy many different things, right, in the supermarket. So I think it will be very helpful. I think we kind of need something guiding everyone, so that in a way that we can also help promote various kind of options to the general public as well.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Yuki, over to you.
Yeah, so for the policy opportunities, so in addition to the previously talked about food security and like new industry economic development, then there's also one advantage of cell agriculture is that the short food miles, like locally produced, and that actually goes quite well with like local economic development and like local brands and those things, especially for regions where they want some new tourist attraction. Or I would say like regional brands, for building regional brands, maybe especially strong in Japan, where they have like local Wagyu brands in regions far from Tokyo. And another potentially huge application is or huge opportunity is actually carbon credit trading with meat. And I know that certain plant-based companies are making their early attempts on that, and depending on how that goes, it could be a game changer, I think.
Sam, over to you on the policy opportunities side of things. How do you see it? Where do you see it? And how do you see it evolving?
Sure, thank you. Well, I'll try and summarize some of the earlier points, I think, that address some of this question as well, which is that it comes down to investment in R&D and unlocking public funding, I think, for alternative proteins from a GFI perspective. Our rallying cry is, as we have always said, is in policy. Getting policymakers to recognize alternative proteins as the food equivalent of what electric vehicles did for transport and what solar did for energy. So too can alternative proteins do for our food system in terms of that kind of revolutionary effect. It remains true, I believe, that alternative proteins are the only scalable solution. The only scalable solution globally to meeting increased protein demand and food security challenges, both of which are key within the Asia-Pacific region particularly. I also really like what Carrie said about the opportunity to connect with consumers and explain the benefits of alternative proteins. And as I mentioned earlier, I think there's some more work that the industry has to do in that space.
Absolutely. Now I would like to take like a couple of like audience questions, like which are already in the Q&A part of it. So one is a few companies have been successful in obtaining regulatory approvals. Is there a mechanism to obtain their learnings which will benefit all, of course, respecting necessary business confidentiality? So this question is from Ashish. I would keep it like open, like Carrie, Yuki, and Sam, like anyone who'd like to take this up. I think we can start with Carrie as well, if we want.
Yeah, sure. I think the US FDA approval, you can find the whole report basically online if you search. So basically a lot of the details can be found there and even the discussion. And so that's for US FDA. For SFA, yeah, indeed, there are confidentiality. The material submitted to the agency would not be disclosed to the external parties. So I think depending on the government, the agencies kind of like a approach. Indeed, some of them are visible to the other and some are not. So that's why I'm going back to the earlier kind of point of discussion. I think some kind of open source in terms of the regularly used methodology of cell line, regularly used kind of like FBS replacement. I think when that is scientifically agreed by some scientists in different jurisdictions or empirically tested, I think it's worthwhile to have a database like that so that if necessary can be made reference to, so that like both the regulator as well as startups, we do not need to spend the hours and the money into going through the process again in those kind of like a discussion and substantiation kind of situation. Yeah.
No, sure, absolutely. Yuki, do you have anything to add on this question?
Yeah, in addition to Carrie's comment, I think there are certain entities like S-Cluster and also us that have got an actual incentive to make this information open, because we are wanting more as many clients as possible to get regulatory approval and use our system to make their own profit. So yeah, that kind of entities can be leveraged for this purpose, I think.
Sure. Sam, anything to add?
Yeah, maybe just one thing, in addition to what has been said previously on the question, that some regulators, I think, have an open door policy too. It's not an all or nothing approach. And I would highlight Fazan's here as one example of that, whereby they engage in pretty open conversation with applicants in advance, and they have a deliberate policy of doing that to ensure that a draft application is as well formed and as robust as it can possibly be before it's formally submitted. And I think hats off to them for doing that. It's, as I say, not an all or nothing approach. So an open conversation with the regulator in question, I think, is also important.
Sure. Now I have a second question from an anonymous participant, but like I would like to like pose this question like a little bit differently. So the question starts with like the nuclear wastewater dispersion like in the oceans and how it can impact like the consumption of seafood in countries like China and Korea, and what it means for the industry. But I would also take it like a little bit further and talk about, like, for example, the big issues which comes up like with regards to the bird flu, which has led to like Singapore actually halting like some of the imports. In France, like we have seen instances where the French were trying to vaccinate like the ducks and the birds there so that they do not get bird flu, and it reduced like a lot of trade a lot of friction in the trade relations between France and US as well. So and we see like parts of it happening like in APAC as well. So how do you see these kind of like environmental hazard, whether it be like discharge of nuclear wastewater or the new sort of like diseases or the disease outbreaks which happens in animals? Like how do you see that impacting like the industry altogether, and how do you see like it would change the focus of the government in terms of identifying cultivated meat as an opportunity of being like a safer alternative to meat, and a safer alternative which has like less a propensity for diseases or like these kind of external things around nuclear discharge, nuclear water discharge?
Yeah, I would say this is a somewhat tricky question, because people who are concerned about food safety, including non-scientific ones, are the ones who actively avoid like food tech products. So so that means like because there's an issue of radioactive discharge or whatever, so therefore cell cultured meat, that sort of logic doesn't hold for those kind of consumers. So whether to go with this argument is, I think, very tricky.
Sure, absolutely. But do you see a scenario, just dwelling a little bit on this, but do you see a scenario where, because of, for example, like bird flu or any kind of disease outbreak, governments start viewing like cultivated meat as a safer option for the population to consume, and would it lead to some kind of consumer movement in the future?
Yeah, so that's another tricky part, not from the consumer side, but from the tricky from how to communicate with the existing industry sort of argument. And basically, talking sort of like we should not be appearing like we're doing a smear campaign on the existing industries, and the kind of bird flu and such can fall into that sort of situation, which basically can lead to like a negative consumer reaction, or the counter smear campaign, or the kind of things that no one would like to see. So at least in Japan, this kind of bird flu, therefore cell cultured meat kind of logic is so far not being part of the policy makers.
Sure. Carrie, your perspective on this?
Yeah, I think what we can kind of like, we can, in a nutshell, actually, what we are doing, like alternative protein, like cellular aquaculture, is actually, like in terms of the seafood, we are the third way. So the first method is to catch them from the ocean, right? The second approach is aquaculture, to grow them. And I think we kind of at this moment position ourselves as the third kind of option. I think it's coming, like talking to government policymaker, I think it can be shaped as a risk assessment or risk management like option, because like what if I think we gone through COVID, and I think people are quite forgetful, and we are now already forgotten about like the panic time when we don't get a certain food from importing from other places, right? So I think the risk assessment kind of concept is that, okay, if there is any impact on be it the natural system, be it the climate extremality, be it like the zoonotic disease and things like that, how can a region or a country actually have alternative way of fulfilling the need internally for the population? And I think cellular aquaculture make it a lot more viable, although we still need to input a lot of raw material, but then those raw material can be stockpiled, those can be actually produced in a way that is more easily than needing a big piece of arable lands and things like that. So I think this is the angle that we might be able to share more, because I think when it comes to investment, when it comes to politics, I mean, we're talking about a lot of risk here, and I think anything that can help with alleviating risk as an option, I think it may be helpful in some of these conversations.
No, sure, absolutely. And I would like to just come back to Sam as well on this issue. How do you see like the current affairs like shaping the industry in a way?
I mean, I'd go back to a point I made earlier in that alternative proteins are a scalable solution to many issues, including antimicrobial resistance and global health and nutrition, I think more broadly. I don't think the AMR example has yet been front of mind for many governments, but certainly I'd say it's a consideration within some governments. Industrial animal ag systems utilize, I believe, from memory, in the US, 80% of antibiotics, for example. That's a whopping percentage. And the focus on safety and the rigor of safety assessments for cultivated meat products, I think, could stand the cultivated meat sector in good stead in that regard. I'd also note that conversation on alternative protein is actually broader than cultivated meat. It also includes, of course, plant-based products, which don't carry those same disease risks in general when we're talking about alternative proteins more broadly.
No, thank you so much for that perspective. Now I'd like to sort of like go like a little bit into the wrap-up mode of things, and like direct like few questions which would be more with regards to like the closing remarks, or and you can shape the closing remarks the way you want. Like the first perspective being, what would be the key things which the industry can do, like in terms of your recommendation? What would you think the governments can do? And at the same point in time, the other stakeholder, whether it be the trade associations, the trade groups, what do you think, like all the stakeholders, like if you have to give like recommendations, what would be your final recommendations to each of these stakeholders? So maybe we can start with Yuki, and then we can go to Carrie, and then Sam can have the last word.
Yeah, so right now I'm about the industry groups and the different startups. I'm optimistic and thankful. My recommendations basically keep on going. So I think we are in the right direction, although we see some risks and some bugs ahead, but that's something we already talked about.
Sure, Carrie, your last words.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things going on, and I think even on the labeling and everything is like kind of a lot of like discussion. But maybe for GFI, because I think a lot of other like GFI taking a very basically one of the leading organization in the alternative protein. I think it may be because we are like Yuki said, there are the APAC Society of Cellular Agriculture, there's the Global Alliance of Cellular Agriculture, and we are a trade union, and one way or the other we represent certain voice. But like what I'm just trying to advocate here is that the whole batch of open source information and those kind of conversation, it may be good to come from a pretty neutral independent organization. And I think there have been a lot of work. I think they are highly valuable works on the scientific aspects and also the industry status report, etc. By GFI. Maybe some of these can be quite focused to different countries. As GFI sees some of these regional government, they are already quite open to accepting or kind of like approving cultivated meat. And I think that some of these will be maybe helpful to move forward one of these two like regions into the alliance side.
Sure, Samuel.
Sure, thank you. Just picking up on Carrie's last point, I'd note that GFI is now in the process of translating key documents into different languages within Asia. And I think within the last 6 months or so, we've translated 3 or 4 key documents, including summaries of the most recent State of the Industry report into both Korean and Japanese, and there's more to come. And as Yuki said, I think I'd wrap up with optimism. Just from a meta level, third-party estimates indicate that demand for meat and seafood within Asia will increase an additional 78% between 2018 and 2050, 78% increase. Asia's already the largest meat producer by a significant margin, about 43% of global supply, despite the fact that per capita consumption of animal meat in Europe and North America is 8 times that of Asia. In other words, Asia's currently responsible for nearly half of meat production, even though individual consumers have historically eaten far less of it per capita than in the West. And that's a reality, actually, we need to remember that's actually shifting as Asia's middle class expands. And therein lies the social demand within Asia for meat products, be it cultivated or conventional. And this equates to an economic potential, obviously, for the sector. And for those countries specifically, meeting that demand by manufacturing the products that consumers want. And I think governments around the region recognize this as an economic opportunity. So I'd wrap up by saying that creating the enabling policies to support the R&D, the manufacture, and the scale up of companies able to meet that demand that we know is coming for meat and seafood products in the future is really where governments play the most important role. In terms of funding itself, GFI APAC's recent State of the Industry report showed that all-time alternative protein financing received 14.2 billion in private financing globally, of which just 1.2 billion was in APAC. So the gap there is pretty stark. In the public space, a 1 billion global figure meant $200 million in APAC from public funds. We need more public financing. Going back to that point I've made a couple of times, to catalyze the sector in the same way that we saw support for the solar sector catalyze the change in renewable energies, and the same way that we saw support for electric vehicle manufacture catalyze the change in global transportation, as we're seeing now. The technology is maturing, and just like solar did for energy and EVs have done for transportation, so too will alternative proteins do for the food sector. So final point, I suppose, I'd be repeating the call that we need to join the links between the excellent work government regulators are doing and the economic impact and potential of the sector, which some government departments see and of course industry sees as well.
Sure, thank you. Those are really excellent points, and thank you so much everyone for joining this webinar. I would like to thank the speakers for their wonderful inputs, and to the audience for their questions as well. We will post a recording on our YouTube channel, and we will email a recording of the webinar within the next few days as well. So if you missed part of it or didn't catch something, no worries, we'll send it to you, and you can revisit it later on as well. On behalf of GFI APAC, I would like to thank Carrie, Yuki, and Sam again, and thank you so much for the audience who joined us today. Looking forward to the next one. Thank you.